Good day and thank you for joining Civilnet. Our guest today is Dr. Benjamin Cole. He's an assistant professor of political science and international relations at Simmons College. Thank you for being here today.
Thank you for having me.
And what brings you to Armenia at this time?
I'm visiting Armenia with faculty from Stonehill College who are running a program called Lion in Armenia, where they insert students into internships and tie that together with course material. And Simmons College is thinking about joining the Lion program and sending our own students here.
And how are negotiations going, or how did you find the situation here? As in, would Armenia be a constructive place to stand?
Oh, I think so. Yeah, it's quite lovely. I've met with 3 internship providers so far, and they seem to offer a really excellent opportunity for our students. And I think students would learn a lot about post-conflict societies from studying in Armenia, which has a lot in common with other similar post-conflict states.
Well, Armenia is post-conflict, and there's a conflict going on right now. And in your experience in comparative foreign studies, and also you were a co-author of the Global Peace Report. So how is it looking? What's it looking like for Armenia at this moment?
So predicting the future is always hard to do. Based on what we've seen in the past, and I'm not an Armenian expert, it seems like the situation with Armenia's situation with its neighbors seems to be what I would describe as meta-stable, in that there are always events happening that are escalating and de-escalating conflict, but on the whole things seem to be staying more or less constant. That I think is partly due to outside powers like Russia selling arms to both sides of some of these conflicts, like the Nagorno-Karabakh war. So in terms of immediate future, I don't see Armenia immediately escalating its conflict with either Azerbaijan or its disagreements with Turkey. On the other hand, I don't see any short-term prospects for peaceful settlement of those conflicts. So if you were to ask me about the future, I would say I don't see a whole lot of change coming.
So the global report on systemic peace that was last published in 2014 kind of gives Armenia a good place. It does, even though from what I understand the report doesn't concentrate on the region so much, and it mentions Armenia in passing, but from the report you see that Armenia is relatively legitimate to the authorities, the war situation is relatively calm. I mean, you don't mention war in Armenia. Even though legally the war is not with Armenia, it's with Azerbaijan.
Of course.
Security situation is considered quite safe. So in this past couple of years and following your physical visit to Armenia,
sure,
how would the report change?
Well, that's a good question. So I think with regard to the report and the way that we measure things like security and the way we define things like legitimacy, it's a pretty broad brush. So for example, on security effectiveness, which is one of the 4 or 8 main indicators that feed the State Fragility Index, that's measured on a 4-point scale from 0 to 3, where 3 is you've had a substantial amount of full-scale war in the last 25 years, and 0 is you've had none, or you've had war so long ago that it isn't immediately affecting your security. And so between no war and all war, there's 4 points, right? So Armenia is certainly legally continues to be in a war. The way that we measure that is that there have to be a certain number of actual battle casualties above a certain threshold, and that has to be sustained for multiple years at a time. So in other words, a country has to be actively losing people, soldiers in an armed conflict. It doesn't have to be international, it can be civil, and most wars are civil wars in the last 60 years. We haven't seen evidence that Armenia's security effectiveness situation with regard to that measurement has changed. That's not to say the security situation hasn't changed, right?
Is it because such information wasn't provided, or it's not accessible, or it's not open? Because Armenia does have casualties every month on the borderline, especially since 2014. Is that because you weren't aware, or you weren't told that there were regular casualties on the contact line?
So we do struggle sometimes to get information, particularly from areas that haven't been extensively reached by journalists. Nagorno-Karabakh is fairly well covered in the Western press. I think in this case, and I'd have to look at the numbers to tell you for sure, but the number of deaths hasn't crossed the threshold that we use to define an ongoing security effectiveness level 1 conflict. It's not to say that there's none, it just hasn't reached that bar yet. And that's something that we struggle with every conflict. We need to set some level by which we say you've reached a new sort of level of evil in your warfare that has to meet all sorts of other criteria as well. So it's not that we aren't aware of Armenia's situation, it's more that it hasn't crossed that somewhat arbitrary threshold we have to set for measurement reasons.
And also you speak about government, conflict, development, this whole chain, and also security within this formula. So Armenia is facing a lot of issues now. We have to re-estimate ourselves given recent developments in Nagorno-Karabakh, as if we have the right governments to face the security situation on the border. So in that formula and those relations, how do you evaluate Armenia's situation now?
I mean, so as a scholar, my focus is on democratic transition and how we measure the strength of a democracy, including things like corruption and fraudulent election returns and those sorts of things. And I know personally, and I think the global report may change to reflect this, Armenia has some real challenges in that area. And at the core of the report is an assumption that governance, conflict, development are intrinsically related. You can't study democracy without understanding conflict. You can't study development without understanding democracy. They go together. And so in that sense, Armenia has some real struggles and has had since post-Soviet era began. And I haven't seen a whole lot of improvement in terms of governance quality over the last few years. And I think if Armenia is going to continue to access increased support from international institutions like the World Bank or the IMF, particularly where it really needs that with borders in Turkey and Azerbaijan closed, that some movement towards greater transparency, reducing corruption is vital.
So also your study goes back to 1995 and takes the development ever since to this day.
Sure.
So in 1995, if you view Armenia, and let's not concentrate on Armenia, probably the whole region, the Caucasus, from 1995 until now, how has the democratic process developed?
So in general, we see significant improvements between 1995, which is a proxy for the end of the Cold War and independence for most of the Caucasus states, through about 2001. We see movement towards more free elections, stronger checks on the executive in most states in the region. After 2001, we see very little change in most of these states. And after 2005, we see actually some backsliding in some of these countries. I haven't seen a whole lot of backsliding in Armenia, although again, it's not a fine-toothed comb that we're applying. But we have seen backsliding in neighbors to the region. So Russia has gone through some quite extreme democratic backsliding over the last 5 years. The Ukraine has experienced first some extreme backsliding and then of course civil war. So it's not a healthy region. And in fact, one of the things that we've found in creating statistical models that predict to some degree the future of conflict and genocide and sort of most horrific things in world affairs is that your neighborhood matters, that what's going on with your neighbors directly affects you. And if your neighbor is in a civil war, the chances that you will experience civil war go up dramatically. If your neighbor has a coup, the chances that you will experience a democratic backsliding event go up. So Armenia is in a vulnerable place. Turkey is undergoing democratic backsliding. Azerbaijan doesn't have a whole lot of backsliding to accomplish because it's already so authoritarian. Georgia is stable in the sense that it's not currently being invaded. Russia's backslid. The Ukraine has backslid. It's a dangerous place. And Armenia, I mean, actually, if there's one breath of hope, it's that Armenia doesn't seem to be experiencing those neighborhood effects internally. We don't see a whole lot of backsliding. Development trajectories have continued to remain upwards. Armenia has a major unemployment problem, but compared to its neighbors, it's not horrible. The economy seems to be fairly stable and growing. And I think growing in a healthy way. So, I mean, one thing, we measure economic legitimacy, and part of that looks at manufacturing and to what extent are your exports manufactured versus raw materials. Armenia has stores of petroleum and gas and copper that it hasn't tapped. And I think that's actually a healthy thing. And one of the things that we've seen, right, is that the states that rely on natural resource exports for their economies actually, in the long term, experience economic downturn. And part of that is that you become really a pawn to the states that want to buy those resources. There's no incentive to reinvest benefits in the local economy. You don't need education to make a miner. You do need education to make a factory manager, right? And so one thing that I've seen that's hopeful is that Armenia's economy seems to be diversifying and not taking the easy route towards simply pulling things out of the ground and selling them on the market.
We have elections coming up in 2017. Expectations from these elections, they can make or break Armenia's domestic policy and also foreign relations. Do you have any trajectories regarding that?
I don't, simply because I'm not an Armenian expert, but I would emphasize from my own research that elections are incredibly destabilizing. And even in Western democracies, they're very destabilizing events. Fully consolidated democracies with long histories have the institutional mechanisms to sort of absorb or withstand and recover from that instability. But if you look at American politics right now, we're in an election cycle and we're more divided than we've been in a very long time.
Yes, transitioning to American elections. With the two candidates, what changes in foreign policy should be expected from each one?
That is such a good question. I mean, I would say with candidate Clinton, Senator Clinton, I wouldn't expect to see much foreign policy change. The difference between Hillary Clinton and President Obama is a matter of degree. President Obama, I think, has been a bit more hesitant to employ American forces abroad, and biographies and books coming out suggest that that's because he's cognizant of the secondary effects that employment of American troops has. So, an example, we invade Iraq in 2003 and promptly destabilize the entire region, leading to Syrian conflict, and I mean, it's bad. Senator Clinton, I think, is driven by a more neoliberal school in that she would rather apply force in those situations in the name of salvaging democratic freedoms for people that are in vulnerable positions. With Mr. Trump, I have no idea, actually, what his foreign policy goals are. At best, they've been contradictory and incoherent so far. However, in previous transitions from one party to another, even with fairly big personalities, U.S. foreign policy rarely changes very much. Even going from Nixon to Carter, or Carter to President Reagan, where Carter was vocally supportive of democracies and human rights, he still supports Pol Pot. Sort of national security needs tend to trump, as it were, any individual's preferred policy goals.
So Armenians have this good old tradition of expecting genocide recognition with every new elected president in America. Yeah. Do you think there should be expected any change after either one of them might be more prone to recognizing the Armenian genocide? And also, given relations with Turkey have changed globally, a lot of Russia, Germany, Europe in general are not so friendly with Turkey anymore, at least temporarily now. Yeah. At least that seems the situation. Do you think this will affect America and the foreign policy of the next president?
I hope so. I earnestly hope so. I don't know that enough has changed in terms of the security relationships between the United States and Turkey to make a difference on how our chief executive thinks on that. But especially since I've been to Armenia and have been to the Genocide Memorial Museum, I've been struck more and more that there's nothing but cowardice in refusing to admit the sins of your fathers. It doesn't bear on your personal honor to admit that your ancestors did a horrible thing. And it really only grants sort of legitimacy to another people's suffering and allows them to heal. So I earnestly hope that my elected officials will recognize the Armenian genocide. It's such a small gift with such a huge impact.
A lot of people I speak to, political analysts, politicians, diplomats, they say that America should go ahead and do it because there will be no repercussions from Turkey's side because, you know, relations are stable and it's in a situation where neither side wants to disturb them. Yeah. What's your take on that? What are the reasons why that keep America from acknowledging the Armenian genocide, like politically?
So I don't actually honestly know. I suspect that the United States is hoping to maintain a close security relationship with Turkey. I think there's probably some concern that Turkey could use an American official recognition of genocide to turn Turks away from support for the West and move them towards a closer relationship with other powers. But I honestly don't know. It's not clear to me why the American federal government won't. And I think actually the fact that most American states have recognized the Armenian genocide, right, suggests that it's behind the times to not do so. And I think that there's some, at least under the Obama administration, there's been some recognition that some of these policies that are really holdovers from the 1950s don't belong anymore. So I think liberalization with Cuba that's occurred over the last year could signal a change in American foreign policy towards some of these long-standing disagreements.
Thank you very much. Thank you for joining us today. And we thank the viewers for joining us as well.